Hold the ears of the donkey.
Indeed.
Oh! Here we go. Woo! Here comes Maya. She's wearing a kimono. She's walking backwards. Oh yeah. There she goes. Now it's my turn. I'm gonna walk me off of Santana. Oh! And now here comes Maya. Yay.
Good morning, Timothy. Thank you very much for the background sound. I'm not going to use any other words. It's a pleasure to see you again this morning. Thank you for joining us. To everybody who is listening to us in Clubhouse, good morning. Thank you for being here on, is this August the 27th? I think
It
it
is.
is. Yes, indeed. And for everybody who is watching us on LinkedIn or Clubhouse. Oh, no, that's actually YouTube. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so this is, as Timothy mentioned earlier, this is the last week of August. And even though some people are still in summer vacation, there is no holidays for the politicians in Japan. And Timothy, again, I'm not going to keep you waiting, and I'll give you the floor.
Great.
Just 3, 2, 1 seconds. It's you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Maya. And welcome to the 133rd episode of Japanese Politics One-on-One, where we talk about Japanese politics and give you the opportunity to kind of express your views on it, ask questions in the Q&A. I try and wrap this up in a 30-minute tight briefing for you. We've got a global audience. It continues to grow. I'm so appreciative of everybody that has tuned in and who is interested enough in Japanese politics to kind of pursue this and to continue to sign in. Please hit like and share if you don't mind. And as always, our engagement rates are through the roof. People are providing comments to Maya throughout the briefing, and we address those. So thank you very much for that. And without further ado, let me get to episode 133. Today is August 27th. This is the last weekend of the summer of August, and we move into September on Friday. By the way, you might not remember, but Friday is the 100th anniversary of the Great Kanto earthquake. That was in 1923. It was an earthquake that was centered about 14 miles underground in the middle of Sagami Bay. So that's the bay that's on the other side of the Yokohama Peninsula. There's the Tokyo Bay, the Yokohama Peninsula, and then Sagami Bay. It is a very deep, huge bay. You could take Mount Fuji, flip it upside down, and put it into Sagami Bay, and it would not break the water surface. It is that deep. This earthquake was measured to be around a 7.9. It lasted for between 10 and 14 seconds and absolutely destroyed the city of Yokohama, where it was closest to the epicenter, and a 20-foot high tsunami crashed into the coastal area there within minutes, because Yokohama is facing, or the Yokohama Peninsula is facing the Sagami Bay. The tremors immediately went to Tokyo as well, and Tokyo was caught in a conflagration that killed more than 140,000 people. This is just amazing what it did to Tokyo, what it did to Japan as a nation. And at that point in time, Yokohama was the center of commerce and industry and fashion, and all of the foreigners living there was really beginning to boom. It was about 19 years before Japan began to get into the war. It was launching its period of colonization, but it was a very vibrant time for Tokyo during the Meiji period. A lot of new ideas coming in, cigar smoking, chocolate eating. Even the fashion of the time was changing very rapidly. Yokohama was completely obliterated. In fact, in Tokyo, and there are stories about this all the time, and I only reflect on it because it was so important in Japanese history. It accelerated the number of Japanese going to Brazil, and the Brazilian Nisei population there just exploded. But it did so many other things, and like with many countries, when in the face of adversity, war is always a good option. And so There was the Great Kanto earthquake, and then Japan went on its march. This kind of xenophobia began during that time. You might remember the attack against the Korean population, and in the Sumida River, there people just fled there because to get away from the flames that were just beginning to spread throughout Tokyo. And there were 44,000 people that were gathered there. There was a wind that whipped up. It became a kind of a fire tornado that swept through the valley of the Sumidagawa River. And it killed all but 300 people that were gathered there, escaping from the flames, that were in the water or that were jumping from the bridge in the vicinity. And it was just one of those horrible things that just by a freak of nature, this fire tornado swept through that area. And just there's so many stories about that. But the anniversary is on Friday. You're going to hear a lot about that in the press on Friday and Saturday. The Museum of Science and Nature is having an exhibition where they have colorized photos of that. And if you want to visit it, it is open on Friday and Saturday. I think there will be a week-long exhibition there. So please take a look at that if you have a chance. The Abe faction has the shakeup that we've reported on recently is beginning to become a little bit clear. Who's on first base, who's on second base. And it turns out that the former prime minister, Mr. Mori, who was the chairman of the Olympic Committee and kind of gave up that position as a result of a bit of a scandal, he is a bit of a playmaker in the Abe faction now. It was at one time known as the Mori faction. And so I want to talk a little bit about what the shakeup is going on there and how it's being clear. You've also heard, since you're tuning into this briefing every weekend, that the Fukushima water release started on Thursday. The Prime Minister went on TV on Thursday. He announced that he was going to be doing that. We already knew that. He visited Fukushima, I think, on Saturday of last week after coming back from Camp David. A pretty successful trilateral meeting in Camp David with President Yoon and President Biden. But they began the release on Thursday, so a lot is going to come out as a consequence of that. And I'd like to just touch base on that a little bit for you. India landed its moon rover on Thursday. Thursday was a big day, I guess. This is a big deal for India. To land a rover on the moon. It's, only China and the United States have done that. India is now joining too. The Japanese are hot on the heels to land a rover there. They've got plans for that. It's in the works. They had a rocket launch yesterday. SpaceX did, where a Japanese astronaut was on the flight going to the space station. So this initiative is really beginning to take a lot of energy, not just within Japan, but throughout the world too. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Komeito, as you know, is a coalition partner with the LDP. They've had a bit of a fight with what's going to happen with the 30 seats that are in the 30 lower house seats in Tokyo. So there are 30 seats. According to the gerrymandering rule of 10-10, Tokyo received 5 new seats. That's a big deal for the next election of lower house members. So there are 5 new seats. Komeito wanted one particular seat, a new one, seat number 29 in the Tokyo district. And the LDP began to play politics with them. And one of the big political heavyweights, Mr. Hagiura, had a friend he wanted in the 29th. So it kind of broke the bond between Komeito and the LDP. They've been at loggerheads ever since there. They had a little bit of kissy face just this last week on Thursday with the Prime Minister. The leader of the Komeito party, Yamaguchi, met with Kishida on Thursday. I think they had dinner together. They talked about mending the fences. It looks like they came to an agreement. And now Komeito has said that when there is an election for the lower house, they will support those candidates in the Tokyo district of the LDP where they do not have a candidate. So that's a big deal, and it's a signature move that something is coming up. And as I wrote on LinkedIn announcing, actually piggybacking on Maya's announcement of this briefing today, September is building up to be a real blockbuster month. It's going to be a little bit slow at the beginning. The Prime Minister has a lot of international trips that he's obligated to, G20, Indonesia. He's got a lot of things going on at the first part of the month. But in the later part of the month, we are anticipating a shakeup of the current cabinet. And that's going to be a big deal. And that's going to portend a lot of other things that are going to be shaking out. And also a lot of the things that we're talking about today. North Korea fired a rocket this last Wednesday. It was carrying a satellite for surveillance and observation. It was supposed to be in geocentric orbit. It failed on its third stage and crashed into the Philippine Sea. And this was maybe their third attempt to launch this rocket and their third failure. Our great leader, Kim of North Korea, has publicly stated that in spite of that failure, there was a lot that they learned from it, and he will be launching another replacement satellite in October. So with Camp David just, not even a week behind us, and this new launch, you can imagine that South Korea, Japan, and the United States see this as a great opportunity for collaboration and to stymie the exploratory ambitions of North Korea in this area. The group within the LDP and Komeito dealing with not quite Article 9, but dealing with how Japan can export and develop jointly or singly equipment and airplanes that have defensive capabilities that are military in nature. And Article 9 prevents the country from producing offensive weapons, but defensive weapons are okay. But with this kind of push towards a military industrial complex where Japan can embed a lot of its technology and its prowess in manufacturing in the defense area, generates a lot of wealth. I mean, look at what North Korea has been able to do. It's exporting a lot of its defense capabilities to other countries, and Japan needs something else to supplement the declining manufacturing base that it has had for 20, 25 years. That is one of the reasons why it's so much in the economic doldrums, is that it exported its manufacturing throughout all of Southeast Asia, and it's basically hollowed out the Japanese economy. So it needs to come back with something else, and defense capabilities are one of the areas that it has identified that it wants to excel in. Also, chips and high-end chips, that's further down the road, but they are developing a jet fighter with Britain and Italy. There's a lot of manufacturing going on with components that are that have offensive weapons attached to them. And the Komeito is, of course, backing Article 9 and saying you guys need to go slow before you begin to promote this. And the LDP is saying we need to really jigger this up. We've got a lot of obligations. We've got Quad. We're now in an exercise with Australia, sea exercises. We've got the jets, the fighter jets that are traveling to Australia right now in a flight to do joint exercises with Australia. So there's a lot going on here that we can begin to build this industry here in Japan, and we want to be able to expand that. So there's a lot of consternation going on there about the restrictions of Article 9 and the drive to generate some revenue. The Prime Minister is in a real bind here with the amount of money that he needs to spend, the revenue that he's generating from bond sales, and the amount of money that is just going out of Japan because of the yen-dollar exchange rate. I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And the Democratic Party for the People is having its election this week. They will choose their new party leader, or they'll reappoint the current party leader. It's a pretty big deal because although the Democratic People's Party is not, it's probably the sixth or the fifth largest political party. It has maybe, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 seats in total in the Diet, but it is somewhat close to the LDP. It is not a complete opposition party. It's not like the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. How the leader and the leaders are very distinct in what their positions are. So I'd like to get into a little bit of that. So first of all, let's get into what's going on with the Abe faction. They had a meeting. They have a meeting every Thursday, as you know, a lunch meeting. 2 Thursdays ago, they had a big conclave to talk about what we're going to do about leadership. It's been a year since Mr. Abe was assassinated. We still haven't come up with a plan for leadership. And they did decide that Shionomiya Ryu would be the committee head. They don't really call him the leader, they call him the head of the committee. And there was a committee of people who are either in top positions within the LDP leadership or they hold a cabinet portfolio. So there are about 5 of them. And then surrounding them, there's another group that are close to that are maybe just immediately have been cabinet ministers, or they hold positions of authority, or they've been just elected so many times that you can't ignore their voices. And this group is, what they've decided is that it is too important for us to be not more front in the front of the face of the prime minister just because we don't have a leader. We need to coalesce our forces. We're 100 members. We are more than twice as big as the next biggest faction. And the prime minister, so the Abe faction and the Kishida faction, they're kind of on different parts of the LDP spectrum. The LDP spectrum is a kind of a tent of lots of different interests, but they all believe in the precepts of what the LDP stands for, which is revision of the Constitution, a strong military, a strong economy, blue chip companies, that sort of thing. But on the right-hand side sits the Abe faction, and on the left-hand side basically sits the Kishida faction. So Kishida has been able to implement and pursue some of the policies that he is interested in because the Abe faction has been somewhat in disarray, hasn't been able to speak with one voice. And in that vacuum, he has been able to appoint people within the Abe faction adroitly so that he either compromises them or he brings them closer to him so that they are somewhat reluctant to make criticisms. But about 2 days, I wanted to refer you to an article that I read about 2 or 3 days after this conclave in the LDP. And it came out of Georgetown University by a first-year graduate student in Asian Studies. His name is Rintaro Nishimura. He wrote a great article just right after the meeting that really explains it. And the title of it is LDP's right wing tries to fill the vacuum left by Abe. A little bit long article, but I read that article. I was very impressed with how he got all of the right nuances collectively in that article. So I recommend it to your reading. It is a great piece coming out of a graduate student. And as these things begin to meld and kind of come up, we're going to continue to report on it. But it looks like there is a further crack that is appearing there. In the past, Shimomura Hakubun was one of the closest aides to Prime Minister Abe. He was somewhat implicated, kind of heavily, but there were others too, in the Unification Church scandal. He's kept a little bit of a backseat. He was former Minister of Education, you might remember, a good guy, maybe 69 or 70 years old. But he was vying for one of those leadership positions. He would like to be appointed as a candidate for prime minister, for example. He attempted the last time when the Abe faction didn't even decide on, Mr. Abe didn't even decide on any of his lieutenants to be a candidate for prime minister. And as a consequence, Mr. Kishida won that job. But he has been really fomenting, the action to kind of select a leadership. And by the way, I'm a good candidate for leadership. So this this push and pull apparently has been decided by the powers that be to be a little bit deleterious to the party, and he is being kind of pushed aside for other people. It's not going to be Shionoya as the candidate for prime minister. He is a placeholder. He is the spokesman for this committee of the LDP, or the Abe faction. But I think you will begin to see, in anticipation of whatever Mr. Kishida is going to do with the cabinet reshuffle, and they want more cabinet portfolios for the Abe faction, so they have to get their act together. And in addition to that, to a potential closing of the lower house by the prime minister that doesn't look likely before the end of this year, but you never know. It's Japanese politics. We're going to continue to watch that. So as it stands right now, Mr. Hagiura, Mr. Nishimura, Mr. Seko, they are in the kind of the leadership form, but there are other people there too. And in fact, Mr. Shionoya admits that it's still kind of gelling and it's somewhat solidifying. But as the spokesman for the group, they're going to be, bringing these forces together. It's a big deal, and I hope I'm not going too long on it. But there's the Abe branch, and then there's the Fukuda branch within the Abe faction, and there's a little bit of tension there. There's also tension between members of the Abe faction who are in the lower house and in the upper house. And the upper house is kind of monitored and controlled by Mr. Seko, who one idea was that he would break off and have a group of upper house members, which is pretty considerable. And then there's the group that's been elected less than 4 times compared to the group that is been elected 4 times or more. So there is a kind of a critical mass that when you're a member of the Diet and you've survived 4 races, now you begin to, exude power and authority. You're going to get a cabinet position. You're going to rise in popularity. You're pretty much secured. You're good to go. But before that 4th term, and of the lower house members in the Abe faction, 50% are the younger guys. They haven't been in, they haven't survived 4 terms yet. And so they have a tension there too. They would prefer to have a leader that they can go to and schmooze with rather than a committee of people they have to dance around. They don't know who's on first base, who's on second base. And so there's a tension that's going on there. It will be resolved in due course, but I think other factors are going to be happening in Japanese politics that dictate what they need to do. So we're going to keep a close eye on that. You can't be living in Japan or probably anywhere else in this world without knowing that they began the release of the water, the tainted water, in Fukushima on Thursday. This is a big deal trade-wise and economy-wise for Japan because Japan exports so much of its food stuff. China has already put a trade restriction on food from Fukushima and 9 prefectures surrounding Fukushima. So fish and fruit, it can be exported to China. China is Japan's #1 trade partner, as you all know. So this is a big hit to them. What they're doing is they're examining the food stuff that comes in. Sometimes that takes more than 2 or 3 days. And of course, food goes bad as a consequence of that. So it is really hitting the Japanese exporters hard. Hong Kong, Macau, China have basically banned food coming out of Fukushima and surrounding areas. On the other hand, the overtures of the prime minister traveling internationally, being on G7, G20, doing all of the diplomatic things that he's doing, he has convinced more than, 48 countries to relinquish the trade barriers that they had since 2011, since the triple disaster in 2001. So 48 countries. So with China, the amount of trade there just in July was 46 billion yen. That was 33% down from June, just 1 month earlier, and it's a whole 28% down from the year earlier. So just within 1 month, it fell 38%, and year on year trade with Japan is down 28%. So this is a big deal, and it's coming at a time when Japan needs all the revenue it can, even in light of the fact that the Chinese tourists are now coming in, and we're looking forward to, in some degree, the amount of energy and money that they pour into Japan when they come. And they come in heavy droves, as you know. As I mentioned, it's a big deal that India landed this rover on the moon. It landed on the South Pole. As we reported last week, India was in a race with Russia, and actually they launched their Chandrayaan-3 on July 14th, and 10 weeks later, it went to the moon. It landed on the surface on August 23rd. The Russians launched Luna 25 on September 12th, and in 6 weeks, it arrived on the moon. Because of the trajectory, it only took it 6 weeks compared to India's 10 weeks, and it was supposed to land on the moon around the 22nd. So it was going to beat India. There was a big race that was going on. Russia didn't want to be upped by India, so they accelerated it, and they probably have a bigger rocket. They've got probably better rocket telemetry and that kind of experience. But they lost contact with the module on the 19th. They tried to figure it out and give it instructions, and they basically called it quits on the 22nd. And then the Indians landed on the 23rd. This is a big deal. They had a big celebration at the Indian embassy here in Tokyo. This is a boost to India as they begin to gradually develop their launch capabilities. It's a rover that will be there for a whole year examining the South Pole. And the South Pole is important because right under the surface, it is expected that there's lots of water. And with water, you can create fuel, and you can host inhabitations there as a result. So it's a big deal there. For the Soviets, this was the first lunar launch for them in 47 years. So their first launch to the moon was Luna 2, and this was their second attempt to go back there. So for such a long time, even in 1969, when the United States landed man on the moon, it went through a long hiatus, and people are very curious to wonder why man went to the moon and what the moon was all about. And then they went to Mars and beyond, but everybody's kind of left the moon alone for such a long period of time. So there's a renewed interest there, and it's something of great interest, and we're going to continue to report on that. And as a consequence of these successes, JAXA, which is the Japanese Space Launch Agency, they launched their H-2A rocket. They're developing the H-3 rocket. That took off today from Kagoshima, and it is supposed to touch down on the moon in February or January. So it's a longer period of time to get there, but they've got instruments on that. And SpaceX just launched yesterday. They had a delay in 1 day. They were supposed to launch on Friday. They launched on Saturday with 4 astronauts, 1 Japanese, a Russian, an American, and what was it, Dutch? Denmark, yes, a Dutch fellow, which is interesting because the Danes just sold the F-16 jets to Ukraine. So you can understand that there's maybe a little bit of give and take going on here, trading horses on who's on first and who's on second. So it's a big deal that these 4 astronauts took off. The Japanese astronaut is 59-year-old Furukawa Satoshi. He will be on the space station for 6 months, if you can believe that. So this is his second launch, his second time up there, and they will be doing tests, and you'll be hearing more about that. But it's a big deal, and I think you'll be hearing more and more about this space race to the moon. As I mentioned earlier about Komeito and the LDP mending fences, they revived a little bit of their cooperation on Thursday. The prime minister and the leader of Komeito, which is kind of the political arm of the religious Buddhist sect Sokagakkai. So Kishida met with Natsuo Yamaguchi on Thursday night, and initially they were mad because the LDP didn't graciously give them one of the seats in Tokyo that Tokyo won as a result of the gerrymandering known as 1010. 1010 is where 10 seats in the rural districts are given up. So that means, for example, in Yamaguchi, where former Prime Minister Abe is from, and also where current Foreign Minister Hayashi are, they melded two election districts into one. And that caused another bit of a controversy. The Abe faction had a candidate for that position, and the Kishida faction had a candidate for that position. And once again, in horse trading, the LDP acquiesced to Kishida to let their candidate take that position. So they've reduced that in Yamaguchi, but that seat and four others came from all over Japan to go to Tokyo. So the number of seats in Tokyo was 25. It is now 30. And one of those free seats, one of those newly available seats, there's no contender there. There's nobody that you have to fight against. It is a green garden. Komeito wanted that role, and unfortunately, the individual who is in charge of the election policy within the LDP, Mr. Hagiura, who is from the Abe faction, decided that he had a friend that he wanted to run instead. So this caused a huge rift. And Komeito said, we're not going to deal with you guys in Tokyo. This was much earlier when the threat of having the prime minister close down the house about 2 months ago and have a snap election. You'll remember that discussion. It didn't materialize, but in anticipation of that, tempers became very heated. And maybe Mr. Hagiura moved a little bit too quickly and brusquely, as he's sometimes known to do. But in the meantime, Ishin, who was not a coalition, Ishin had made an agreement with Komeito in Kansai during the local elections that they're going to cooperate on a couple of the election seats in the local elections, and Ishin cleaned house. They got the governorship, they got the mayor, they got the majority of the seats in the municipal government in Osaka. They got another governorship in Wakayama. So they were really doing well as a consequence of this coalition they had with Komeito. And there was a promise tied to that Ishin basically reneged on. So they got what they wanted, and then they said, thank you very much, Komeito. So now Komeito is thinking, shoot, we shouldn't be distancing ourselves from the LDP because Ishin is not really that reliable. They are on their own goal. We are already a coalition partner with the LDP. We already have one cabinet seat, so we might want to fix this. And they did that on Tuesday night, and they came back and they said, okay, we're going to cooperate if there's going to be an election. And what this tells you is it's a big deal for Komeito to hold the hat in their hand and go to the prime minister and say, let's work together. It tells you that things are being set up. The table is being set for something else, probably not in September. September's too early. But with the prime minister dealing with so many of these issues, he's got to give the population, he's got to give his colleagues in the Diet and people in the LDP a reason to want him to continue. Or maybe even better than that he does something where he wants to close down the House and have an election so that the LDP ends up with more seats than it did before the election. Because if it doesn't, he's out of there. So that's something that we're watching very carefully. So let's see, the way it looks right now, there are 465 seats in the lower house. If there is a snap election, that's what we're talking about. It's the 465 seats. 289 of those are from a single seat district. That means the LDP runs a candidate, the other parties run a candidate, they fight against each other. More likely than not, the LDP would win that. There are 176 that are proportional. So that means when you go into the voting box, you vote for an individual for the district that you live in, and then you vote for a party for another seat. And then the individuals on a list that is provided by individual parties, depending on how many votes they get, they might have 2 or 3 or 4 proportional seats in that election district. So the LDP has 261 seats in the lower house, and with Komeito has 32 seats. So that's a grand total of 293 seats. So they have a comfortable majority there. It's not a super majority, and that's what they're trying to get at. The Constitutional Democratic Party is the #1 opposition party. So for the Speaker of the House, that is the former head of the Abe faction, and the deputy is always from the opposition party, and that individual is from the Constitutional Democratic Party. They have 96 seats. Ishin has 41 seats. The Democratic Party for the People has 10 seats. The Japanese Communist Party has 10 seats. Independents hold 3 seats. Reiwa holds 3 seats. So the fight that is looming is Ishin with 41 seats. It's half of what the Constitutional Democratic Party has, but it wants to eat what the Democratic Party is already has. So what the temperature is in the Constitutional Democratic Party, and sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. Ishin seems to be more on a roll. Their leadership is more firm and committed, and they've got a bigger vision for what they want to do. The Constitutional Democratic Party and the Democratic People's Party, they're kind of in between, wondering what to do. There is one theory that if we bind together the opposition parties, then we can challenge the LDP. And the other theory is we need to be closer to the LDP so that maybe if the coalition doesn't work with Komeito, that we become a viable candidate. And anyway, there are issues that are important to us that complement what the LDP's positions are, and we want to grow in strength. We want to have, when there's an election, we want to have more members in our party than we did before the election. So there's a lot of horse trading that's going on there, and that's why the election that's going on now, it started Monday a week ago with the Democratic People's Party, is between the current head and the deputy head. And the current head is pushing for, let's stay close to the LDP. We've done well enough with the LDP. I don't want to distance ourselves. I don't want to cause greater controversy. The deputy head, Mr. Maihara, he says, well, it's a better idea to make a coalition with other opposition parties. This theory, this thought is coming from other heavyweights in the political spectrum, who are saying if the opposition party is ever going to have any chance to challenge the LDP, whether it's Ishin or the Constitutional Democratic Party, they can't do it alone. You have to have a coalition of forces, and during an election, we must hold our nose and hold hands with each other just in order to topple the LDP. So there's that side of the spectrum that is considering that, and that's why the election for the Democratic People's Party is so important. That will be this week. They will decide it this week, and we'll talk about it next week, how it comes up. I've got a couple of other issues just to throw in. There's always this kind of erosion of the Article 9, which is the peace article of the Japanese Constitution, which stipulates that Japan cannot have offensive capabilities. It can't even have an army, and that's why the self-defense forces are not an army. They're an agency of defense forces. It's not called an army, even though probably globally it's maybe the 6th largest military force in the world in terms of of money, not in terms of personnel. But they are on a bend now. They're training maritime forces with Australia in the Philippines Sea right now. We talked a little bit about the supply of the ship that was run aground, the Philippine ship that was run aground to extend the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, not unlike China building these artificial islands in the ocean to extend their exclusive economic zone. So supplying the Marines that are on this ship, the ship has been grounded there for maybe 15 years, and they always supply it. They're always manning it so it can be inhabited, but it's not really an island. It's a shoal where the ship was run aground on purpose. So it needs to be supplied, and the Chinese were preventing it from being supplied. So the Australians and the Japanese self-defense forces put together a flotilla of military and maritime forces to go down there. They did resupply it. That's going on at the same time that the Japanese Air Force is on joint maneuvers with Australia. They've flown from Japan to Guam to the Philippines and then to Australia for joint military exercises with tankers and maybe 600 personnel. That will be repeated by the British coming in later in the fall, doing something similar with British forces coming in, British aircraft. So this continues unabated, and this idea of the Prime Minister to develop this military-industrial complex of having offensive weapons or offensive weapons that can be attached to Japanese products, Japanese fighting vehicles or shipping vessels or helicopters or jets, or selling the jet engines, which are not defensive or offensive, they're just military jet engines. So that's why Komeito and the LDP got together this last week to talk about the restrictions on the defense material. So there are five right now. There are 5 areas where they can export Japanese military goods, even if they have offensive capabilities, and that's for rescue, for minesweeping, for surveillance, and for cybersecurity. So there are some components where they can kind of skirt Article 9, but the discussion that the LDP and Komeito were having last week was we need to expand that. So once again, Komeito is holding back a little bit, and the LDP is pushing forward. We need to be able to do this. And once again, Article 9 comes up. So it is inescapable at some point in the very near future that there will be a referendum offered on Article 9. You can just smell it. It's continuing to grow in prominence. And the government of the Prime Minister is advocating that these lethal capabilities need to be considered in export of military equipment. So Japan does not have a military industrial complex. It is looking abroad and seeing what other countries have done and how much they've benefited from having that. And they're scratching their heads thinking, we could use the money, and it's an industry that we haven't developed yet, and we might be pretty good at it. So the Prime Minister is thinking about that. And at the same time, moving on to another area, the Prime Minister is seriously looking for cash. So the amount of bonds that are held by the Japanese government are more than 50%. And they've just increased the value of these bonds by increasing the yield that we've been reporting on and following pretty carefully, so that the bonds become an attractive investment for foreigners and for Japanese alike, mostly foreigners, to purchase these bonds because they have a high rate of return on them. And the Japanese can run their government based on that, but it is debt driven. So ultimately, the Japanese government needs to pay, repurchase those bonds when they're retired. So that amount is coming in. And the Prime Minister has promised money for 2% increase or a 100% increase in defense spending from 1% to 2%. We're gaining in year 1 now In year two, they've begun to scratch their heads and think, where's this money going to come from? Maybe we need to take a little bit of a rest because we can't, without increasing the consumption tax, we really can't pay for this. So the prime minister, he's also promised about childcare. I'm going to make it so that people want to have more children. The declining population, we've got to fix that. And he's earmarked almost as much money in a 3-year program that he's earmarked for the defense spending for 5 years. So that's a big deal. Where is all this money coming from? And it's really beginning to hurt him. Inflation now for normal goods, for what people are experiencing on every day, is about between 3 and 4%. If you add in or you subtract perishables or fuel products, gasoline and the such, it's higher than what the targeted inflation rate is supposed to be, which is 2%. So the latest figures out are that it is still accelerating, but it's not accelerating as fast as predicted. That's good news. But still, people are, the money that they receive is not increasing that much. So the Japanese government has come up with a couple of plans. One is that we're going to charge you more as a company to run your business. That's part of the defense spending increase. Also, we're going to increase the price of tobacco or cigarettes, the ones that you smoke, not the electronic ones, not as highly at least. So they've come up with a plan that if you increase your wages to the employees that work for you, this tax that we're going to impose on everybody else, you get a little bit of a cushion there. So I think a lot of companies now are considering and also raising their wages. People are having a hard time, companies are having a hard time attracting people to join them, even first-year graduates. And the Japanese government is at an alarming rate, because it used to be, for most of the Japan hands here, you remember this, that the number one job position sought for by new graduates was a job in the Japanese government, to become a bureaucrat, to become somebody that had power and authority at the political level. You'd work for your career, and then you had a nice pension. That was the attraction there. But the Japanese government is having real trouble attracting these people, because the private sector is sucking them all in, paying them better wages and signing bonuses to get them in the doors. So there's a real crunch there. There's a huge need for people of high intelligence and technical capabilities, not just for regular cybersecurity and security in general. You've got the digital agency that had to hire 500 people, many from the private sector as well. And you've got the defense agency that needs to have cybersecurity specialists. I don't know where they're going to come from, and they're not producing them fast enough. So the prime minister is in a real pickle. The newest idea, and we've talked about it before, is that they will sell some of the assets that the Japanese government owns. So under various laws, the Japanese government can purchase shares of these companies, but it needs to have a controlling share. It needs to have at least 33 1/3% of the shares if it's going to be investing in these companies. So Japan Tobacco, the Japanese government owns 33% of that. NTT, the Japanese government owns 33%. There are thousands of companies and shipyards and port facilities and forests and all of these things that the Japanese government owns. And according to the law, they need to own a pretty significant portion of that. The discussions this last week were, let's sell our stake in NTT. They've assigned Mr. Amari, who was initially, you might remember, the Secretary General of the LDP. They had an election for the lower house maybe 4 years ago. And even as the Secretary General, he wasn't able to win his seat, even as Secretary General. And so he had to give that up. And he's still a member of the Diet, but he suffered badly as a result of that. I think it was somewhat due to his personality. He was a really rising star. He's an incredible politician, very smart, very affable. But he had a little bit of trouble with a money scandal initiated by, they say, his Diet secretary. So in any event, he is the chairman of this committee to talk about relinquishing NTT shares. if the Japanese government did that just for NTT, it would produce about 4 trillion yen. That means that they would sell off 100% of their holdings, which is 33%. That would generate about 27 billion US dollars. Um, but when you think about it, that's, for the defense spending for the 5 years of defense spending that Mr. Kishida has committed to, that's $43 trillion over 5 years. So if they sell NTT, that's 4 trillion. It's not close to 43 trillion. So I think if they start with the NTT and they sell that off, then it will start this slow march of decoupling from being so engaged with the Japanese economy. It's going to change Japan, obviously, but the prime minister is really in a pickle trying to figure out how he's going to get money to pay for all of these things that are demanded of him. And he would love to have a snap election where people clap their hands and slap him on the back and say, you're doing a good job. It doesn't look like it's going to materialize. He also has a couple of troubles, and I'll close up my briefing with this. He has a couple of troubles with people that are close to him. Mr. Kihara, Seiji Kihara, is the deputy chief cabinet secretary, very close to the prime minister, his right-hand man. He's in the Kishida faction. And I've mentioned this before, that the young lady that he married about 10 years ago, he was able to marry her because her previous husband died in what looked like a suicide at a time when Mr. Kihara was dating her. And it's turned out that perhaps that wasn't a suicide, it was a murder. And now they're looking for who the murderer was. And there's a growing scandal that the public prosecutor's office was persuaded to just sweep it under the carpet and say it was a suicide. Let's not pursue this any further because there are political forces at play here. That went on for 10 years, and now it's beginning to come up that no, in fact, it was a murder, and nobody kills themselves in the way that this body was found. There was a controversy with the kids. He was visiting the house. His estranged wife escaped with the kids, and then he was found in the house with his throat slit. So I haven't gotten into a whole lot of detail on that. I've received a couple of comments on it in the thread that Maya feeds to us. So if you want to get into a little bit more of the gory details, I'm happy to do that. But it is one of the things that's bothering the prime minister. He can't really fire the guy because he's deputy cabinet secretary right now. And, after relinquishing 4 cabinet secretaries early in his tenure, it would really, really look bad. He has other issues too. He's got Terada Minoru, who is implicated in a bribery scandal that is beginning to surface, and Bunshun is beginning to hone in on him. He's very close to the prime minister as well. You've got Akimoto Masatoshi, who looks like he's implicated in a bribery scandal. He resigned from his political position 2 weeks ago. The police are hot on his trail, and if he resigns before September 14th, if he turns his badge in because he knows he's going to be arrested, for example, then that means that there would be a by-election for his seat by October 22nd. So once again, this is just another piece of firewood thrown into what's building up to be an inferno for the prime minister. And finally, the United Nations Human Rights Council visited Japan earlier this month. You might remember that. Investigating what was going on with Johnny's Gym Show and all of the complaints that they received of the male actors and the male dancers and the singers who Johnny's Gym Show had a stranglehold on. If anybody in NHK or in television wanted one of these performers or wanted to sign them or have them appear on a show, they had to go through Johnny's Gym Show. And Johnny Kitagawa died about 8 years ago, and now all of this is becoming more and more out in the open. The victims have been complaining that, whenever they were there, they were always sexually harassed, and they were committed to performing for Johnny Kitagawa. And this went on under the noses of the entertainment industry and the politicians. And so there is a growing criticism now that the UN Council on Human Rights visited Japan. It's not even something that was initiated by the Japanese government to protect their own citizens. It was an outside force, once again, Gaiatsu. So this looks like it's another well-landed punch to the prime minister. He's trying to deal with that now. But there's a lot going on that's of great consequence. And like I said, this is the last week of August. We move into September on Friday. September is going to be an incredibly busy month. Towards the end of the month, the beginning of the month, there's a lot of international travel for the prime minister. Still, things continue to go on. We can always expect several wrenches to be thrown into the works, but we're going to continue to watch that. We'll report to you this time next Sunday, as always, for episode 134. I look forward to it. And once again, thank you very much for tuning in. Please hit like, comment if you can. Keep the engagement going. Thank you very much for tuning in. Maya?
Okay, I unmuted myself eventually. Thank you. Great, Timothy. Okay, so while we're waiting for comments and questions in Clubhouse, also on LinkedIn, I have a couple of questions to you. So the first thing you mentioned, just the last thing you actually talked about today was that Mr. Kishida is facing several issues, and most of them are with people really close to him in politics. And then, so my question is, we kind of didn't talk about this today, about, a possible reshuffle of the government or a snap election. So what are the chances, given these circumstances at the moment, what are the chances
Great.
of them?
Yeah, great question. And I didn't really go into it much. So September is going to be busy because the prime minister is traveling and he will shuffle the cabinet towards the end of September, probably in the late half of the month. And who he takes out and who he puts in and what happens to the people that he takes out is incredibly important, and it telegraphs what's going to happen in the very near term. So we do have a cabinet reshuffle coming up in September. We're all looking forward to that. And the number of people that will be switched out. So typically in a cabinet reshuffle, there are 21, there are more cabinet members, but in the cabinet proper, there are about 21 cabinet officials that whenever the TV talks about the cabinet meeting and then they pan on the prime minister walking into the room and everybody stands up and then they sit down and they have a photo op and then the photo op finishes and then they go into their meeting. That's about 21 people. Typically about 8 or 9 of those are switched out in a cabinet reshuffle. So if it's more than that, and I suspect it will be more than that, it does send a tone of maybe shakiness within the prime minister's inner circle, or the fact that the cabinet ministers who have now 2 years under their belt, they've really kind of exercised themselves, they're on speaking tours, they're helping the prime minister run the government, to have them shifted out and have somebody else coming in. It's very disruptive. But it's not only that, it's also the cascading of parliamentary vice ministers. And by the way, the 3 people that I mentioned to you are 2 of the 3 are or were parliamentary vice ministers. So that's a pretty big deal. It means that their next step is going to be at the ministerial level. So it's hotly anticipated what's going to happen and what the prime minister is going to do, who he's going to get out, and who he's going to put in. And this once again tells you why the Abe faction really needs to get their act together so that they can insist to Mr. Kishida, we want 4 cabinet posts. If you give us 3, we're going to be really, really upset with you. So at least give us 4. That makes a big deal. There's money tied to that. There's prestige and opportunity tied to that. So it's incredibly important for these individual factions to do better in successive administrations. I hope that's responsive, Maya.
Yes, it is. And then I was thinking also while listening to you that it's interesting that we haven't seen any leakage from the Abe faction to the other factions yet, even though it's been over a year after the assassination of Mr. Abe, and the faction has been more or less leaderless. Still, people stick to the faction. So what is it? Is it the hope that the faction will eventually get its
Yeah.
leaders? Yes, and
Well,
so they
it's power. It's power in numbers. The fact that they are a cohesive whole, even without a leader, they still have a lot of throw weight. If they had even somebody who was a spokesman for them, it enhances their throw weight. But if they have a strong leader, and they don't, so that was one of the problems with Mr. Abe. He didn't really identify a successor. He didn't. He had a couple of people that he liked. He patted on the head. He slapped them on the back. He, showed them what to do, but he didn't have anybody that he really liked. In fact, when it came time for him to put his weight behind a candidate for prime minister, he went out of his faction and chose somebody else, an independent, Takaichi, to be the candidate for prime minister. So you've got to think that. I mean, if I was in the Abe faction, I'd be a little bit upset with that. But if you're Mr. Abe, you're probably a little bit upset with your 100 members too. What the hell's going on with you guys? How come I don't have a strong leader? How come there's nobody that I can rely on or depend upon? I don't know. But yes, there is great energy in numbers, and by far, they are greater than the next two political parties in competition. Not political parties, but political factions within the LDP.
fractions. I see. Okay, so we have a comment from Hiroko-san on LinkedIn. There, we are going back now to the Fukushima water release, and her comment is that there are several different ways to call for the water used to cool down the Fukushima reactors. So those ways are treated water, tainted water, contaminated water with tritium, or so on. It is a big deal how you call it, especially in the media, because it misleads people. Yes. So because you commented about actually the trouble with food exports from Fukushima, the trouble with China, also Hong Kong and Macau, and it looks like there is a lot of upheaval there when it comes to that water. But at the same time, it seems that the level of tritium and also any other elements there is way below the standards that are
Sure.
accepted by the International Atomic, what was that? The IAEA,
IAEA, right.
the International Atomic Energy Association, I believe, or Association of Atomic.
Agency, right.
So, do you think that this is more or less political rather than anything else? I mean, all that. I guess it is indeed, but maybe some people are genuinely
Okay.
concerned about
I,
that.
I can't get into the details like Hiroko can get into them, but I can tell you that the amount of water that has been treated for release is in the thousands and thousands of gallons. And as they are releasing that, this will take them about 30 years to release all of that. But they have stage one, they have stage two water, they have stage three water, and they have stage four contaminated product like clothing, metal, trucks, all of the equipment that actually was irradiated. That's not going to be released into the water. And probably they're hoping the technology for the second and the third will be gradually improved so that at some point in time they can begin to release some of that too. But the water that has been treated, it's still going to take them 30 years to release, and it just comes out in a trickle, but it will increase as the temperature goes down, as the amount of public concern begins to fade a little bit. That will go down, but also politically, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, has already said he'll be there on Friday and he's going to eat some fish from Fukushima. He's going to meet with the mayor. So expect the newspapers to be replete with the ambassador eating some sushi from Fukushima and telling everybody this is safe. It meets all the standards. Japan is great. Japan is, let's go Japan. We're going to be building, better things for the future. And Japan and the United States are really tight. So that will be coming out this Friday.
And do you expect that to have any, let's say, impact on the rating of the current cabinet in Japan and Mr. Kishida as well?
You're not talking about the fact that Rahm Emanuel will be in Fukushima. You're
No,
talking about
oh,
the
the
release
release.
of the water.
Exactly. Yes. Sorry.
Well, so we talked about this when the prime minister was weighing having a snap election or not having a snap election, and the analysis was if he doesn't have the snap election now, if he has it now, it's not going to be that great. The LDP is probably going to end up at par, or maybe losing 20 seats or so. It'll be a disaster for the prime minister. But if he waits, it's not going to get any easier. It's not going to get any better. The inflation rate, the defense spending, he hasn't figured that out. He's made promises about child rearing. He's earmarked money for that. He doesn't know where that money's going to come from. And he's got to, at some point, probably in September, release the irradiated water. And that's going to cause a huge firestorm throughout Southeast Asia. So he doesn't have many good things that are coming towards him, and so that's why I'm a little bit reluctant to be too expansive about a snap election. I'm more enthusiastic about a change in the cabinet posts. I think that might generate a little bit of goodwill towards him, but he needs to come up with money quick so that he can begin to spread it around and people begin to like him once again. His approval rating, as you know, is really in a danger zone. It's probably 28 or so percent approval rating, and the disapproval rating is beyond 50%. So he's got to do something. As much as he would like to have a snap election, I just don't see it. I don't see it happening. Maybe until the end of his term as prime minister, which is in the fall of next year.
Okay, thank you for that. And then to this point, there is a comment in Clubhouse from Elizabeth Green. So she wrote that this is a big issue for all the Asia Pacific Green parties. They were surprised to learn that the US is facing the same dumping issue with the Indian Point nukes on the Hudson River. The US Democratic Party, lower house of the state legislature, failed to pass a law to prevent dumping. So obviously, there are issues like this not only in Japan, but of course in the United States. And I believe that other countries, some other countries face similar issues as well, even though they are not probably talked about in the press. But
that's right.
How it is. Okay, and then, so we have also a comment about books. I'm going to talk a little bit, to read it to you later. But before that, another one which came up earlier from Gerard. Okay, before we go that, once again from Elizabeth, then we continue the topic about the Fukushima power plant. So wouldn't the Fukushima wastewater have to diffuse throughout the Pacific Ocean before it gets to the acceptable level? Well, Elizabeth, I'm not sure exactly. Just a moment. The Fukushima wastewater have to diffuse. Well, it has been actually cleaned to the level when it is safe to be released into the Pacific. And of course, when it goes into the ocean, it's going to diffuse even further. So some people say that actually the radiation you get from that water will be the same as that of eating a banana. And I don't know really how true it is, but that's what some people working in the industry say. Okay, thank you for that. And then let me read, Timothy, we're going now back to the issue with shortage of technical staff. You mentioned this a little bit earlier. And then Gerard, he actually commented in Clubhouse that regarding the government having trouble filling tech roles, there are many problems for the government, and this one, as the others, have the same solution: a more progressive, welcoming immigration policy. Yes. Well, Gerard, thank you very much for the comment indeed. Timothy, your thoughts on that?
So there are two ways to go about that. One is to home grow it and invite technicians to come into Japan. I think, yeah, there's just such an allergy to that. I think we find, even though the prime minister has said, I want Japan to be a startup nation. I want companies to come in and create new startups. I want there to be more unicorns. But even if you come in as a new entrant, whether you're a Japanese with an idea and you and your friends from Todai have pulled together some money from your grandfather and you're going to start a company, just the simple things. I mean, and it's even more difficult for a foreigner who has a brilliant idea. It's passed muster. It's launched overseas. He wants to bring it to Japan personally. He comes, he brings the money, he sets up an office, he hires some people. Just setting up a bank account. How maddening is that? And it's one of the key features of starting a company. And I think everybody that's been through this process is just scratching their heads and saying, what in the hell is with that? The one idea is that we will send young kids who want to learn how to be entrepreneurs. Let's send them to Silicon Valley, for example, and let them through osmosis, work there and live there. We'll pay part of their salary. So that's one idea. And although you might think that's a harebrained idea, I think most of the people that are Japan hands now, people that are in the audience now, probably had their start either on a Mumbusho scholarship or on a homestay or something like that. So it does take a while for that to matriculate, to gestate. But I think it's a good way to kind of build that cadre of technocrats. Maybe it's even quicker for the technology field rather than what we have had to go through in terms of linguistics and cultural affinity and that sort of thing. But yeah, bringing in more foreigners who have the chops, I think that's not what they need. What they need are people who are already familiar with Japanese. They're enculturated. They are Japanese. It's just that they're brilliant in the skills that they need, and they don't have them. So they're in a real conundrum. It's just like the issue with how are we going to get women more engaged in the economy? How are we going to elevate them and give them a reason for wanting to aspire to leadership and to contribute? Because if we can't get the women more engaged, then the option is we've got to bring in more foreigners. And they tried that during the Abe administration. It didn't succeed. I can't say that it failed because the position and the influence of women in Japanese government and business and industry now is vastly greater than it was in the early Abe administration. But it's still not enough. And as a consequence, you see lots of foreigners coming to Japan, setting up a company, bringing their kids, buying a house. So this evolution is continuing at a very, very brisk pace. So I understand the conundrum that he's in, and the pace of needs is just so high. I just don't know how they're going to be able to accomplish it.
Right. Thank you for that, Gerard. I hope that it also answers it comes as a response to your comment. Yes. Okay. And then, Timothy, there is a question actually on LinkedIn, which is not, I believe, not directly related to politics. So the question comes from Caro Atzinger, I believe. And it is, so what is your favorite book on Japan?
Carlo.
Caro.
Caro.
Yes. Caro.
Okay. And
Yes.
what country is Caro from?
Oh, I'm not sure actually. I have to check Caro's profile to say
Okay.
to tell you that. But yes, I don't know whether you're prepared to answer that.
No, I am prepared to answer it. I just want to know how to frame it, depending on what country he's from.
Okay, let me have a look at his profile. So, Caro, I'm going there. Please do not think that we're spying on you. This is for yes. Uh, okay, let me have a look. I'm not sure actually.
Okay. Well, maybe Caro, can you just
You can yes.
ping
Let us
Maya
know.
while I'm answering the question. So here's a shameless plug. My favorite book on Japan is the one that I wrote about 30 years ago. I wrote it in Japanese. It's about the escapades of the first foreigner to work inside the national parliament. it was a great experience, and I think an eye-opening experience for the Japanese who read the book, and also for me, kind of reliving and exposing what it was like to be in that kind of very rarefied atmosphere. But that plug aside, I think the most influential book that I read about Japan, there are a couple of them. Amai no Kozo, which is The Anatomy of Dependence. It's written by a fellow by the name of Doi, Dr. Doi, talking about the psychology of being Japanese and why Japanese make decisions and how they're raised and their selection of words in different situations and the underpinnings of Japanese psychology. It's just a really fascinating book. I think it is reprinted in about 30 languages. I first read it in Japanese when I was in law school, and then I realized later that it was in an English version, and I read it that in that version as well. That's a great story. But I have to say that the book that really inspired and compelled me to become more um, interested in Japan was the very thick book called Shogun that they had a mini series and then they had a movie out of. But this book Shogun, I read it before I came to Japan, and it just kind of really embellished the trials and the tribulations that this foreigner has washing up on shore and being thrown into this incredible, just out of conception culture that he knew nothing about, he had no experience in, and it walks you through his journey of washing up on the shore and then ultimately becoming a samurai with fiefdom and maybe 40 retainers and reporting to the shogun in Tokyo. So it was a great story, very well written. I think it was who wrote it? Was it Michener? It wasn't Michener. It was
James Clavel, was it?
Cavell. Right, that's
Oh,
right. Um,
yes.
a great story. So if I had to be pinned down, I would say that that's, if you want to read about Japan, the history is so important. When if you look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll notice on featured articles that I write a lot about the Japanese castle and how it was constructed and
Mm.
its situation within the beginning of Tokyo as a main capital. It wasn't the capital then, but how it was built and the position of it and how it's geologically positioned as a kind of a planned city. It continues to carry weight and influence just as a consequence of it being a castle city. So history is so important here. That's why I mentioned the Kanto earthquake of 1923. It's everywhere. You feel it, and when you walk through the cities, you can, if you know about it, you can recognize it. If you don't know about it, you just walk through a kind of a right angle in the road. You never even knew it was a kill zone of a former castle or a former domain of some very powerful samurai. So if you don't know it, it escapes you, but it's all important. And I think one of the reasons why Maya we initiated this show in the first place.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And also to answer your question, Carol, I think that, yes, the series written by James Clavell, or did you, sorry, I mispronounced his name, I believe, are great. But also what Timothy mentioned, that is Mr. Doy's, it is actually research. And
Mm-hmm.
there's another book which refers to more recent topics, and it is about business here in Japan. It is written by Professor Ulrika Skidi. I believe that I pronounced her name once again well. And it is called The Business Reinvention of Japan. So it contains a lot of interesting perspectives there. So if you have time, I do recommend you find that book and read it as well. So thank you so very much for the question. And yes, Timothy, Caro answered. He is from Los Angeles.
Okay, yeah,
Yes. Okay.
I played rugby in Santa Monica before I came to Japan. Gosh,
Right.
so long ago.
Yes, it was what, in the Stone Age or what?
It was the Stone Age. Yes,
Okay.
yeah. I couldn't
Right.
spell then either.
Okay, so Timothy, thank you very much for this. It looks like we have exhausted all the questions, and so there are a couple of comments left in Clubhouse. So to everybody who is there, I encourage you to go there and read through the comment section. That is called actually the room chat. And of course, if you want to read the comments later, you can once again go to Clubhouse and have a look there because everything remains there. It is recorded. Also on YouTube, the session will be there as well under Japan Expert Insights. If you happen to go there and watch it back, please remember to hit like. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. We'll be here once again next Sunday at 8:20 with Timothy Langley reporting. Who knows? Maybe from Katsuyama. And
I certainly hope so. It's been a while since I've been on the good ship Santana, although it was just last weekend, but it feels like a long time ago. Every weekend I'm not on the boat, I feel like I'm being rude to her. So it is something of a passion. But just to reiterate, if you like what you see, if you are compelled to continue to join us on this briefing every Sunday morning, please just reward us by hitting like or subscribe or posting a comment, because it really helps us. We don't ask anything else from the audience, but if you could just kind of communicate with us one way or the other, or share it with somebody that you think might be interested in knowing what's going on in Japan, or what's going to be going on, please share the wealth. Thank you very much for that.
thank you. Well, great. That's all for the moment. Timothy, I am